Hi. The topic is the perceptions of race and nationality in the United States. And of course, we have with us Dr. ESchmeller to talk about these perceptions. Dr. Schmeller, during this last segment, let's give you an opportunity to sort of move this whole issue of race from the pre-Columbian era on up to immediately after the Civil War, if you so desire, and to give us some directions in terms of the separation of the races and segregation and how race played an important role in reference to that. I think that that would be quite profitable to do that.
Okay. Well, and something you'd mentioned just before the break about the Caribbean, that's kind of a rich area for study, and one of the travelers I look at is Mary Seacole, a black nurse from Jamaica. She's well known to the nursing students that we have at TSU. They study her. But she traveled to Panama and had a lot of contact with white Americans prior to the Civil War. And her kind of experience gave a unique look at how a black woman on her own kind of had to deal with race. And her kind of experience kind of started moving me a little forward with the work, thinking that she obviously held the British up as kind of ideal. She's a black woman. Her mother had been a slave and had married a Scottish army officer, and she was the offspring of that marriage.
She was a mulatto.
Yes, so it makes it, I mean, definitely what we were kind of talking about earlier kind of brings that in. She defined herself as English. She took great pride in being English. Every opportunity she had to make fun of Americans, she took. Most of the Americans she met were extremely racist and commented on her color, and one even offered to bleach her, which she didn't take very kindly. But that kind of interested me. Why would an English woman whose mother had been a slave, black English woman, why would she still kind of be so attached to her nation? And definitely the English end slavery before the Americans do, 1833. And they kind of hold themselves up as the moral center in a lot of ways among the European nations. Like, look, we've abolished slavery, why can't you? And I wanted to look at Americans. We definitely, the white Americans definitely kind of look to England as their kind of cultural origins. And why not follow? And obviously there's economic issues involved here. But as you move after the Civil War, it was troubling that I found that the English travelers started to display the same kind of racist attitudes you saw among the white Americans.
It was different before the war ended, but as long as Africans were enslaved.
As long as there was something to fight for, and you could talk about you know, freedoms and kind of abstract concepts regarding slavery and all human equality, etc. But once slavery was ended, that kind of racist undertone kind of seems to come forward in the English travelers. And it never really disappeared, obviously, as you well know, in America, before and after the Civil War. And in fact, some would argue Reconstruction, the period 1865 to 1877, was just as bad or worse than it had been before. So I argue that, to some extent, it probably has to do with the fact that both England and the United States, after the Civil War, begin to get involved in imperialism, especially going to Africa. And one of my American black travelers, Thomas L. Johnson, a preacher, wanted to go to Africa and convert the Africans. And his experiences in America were very frustrating to him because he was an educated man and wanted to do good in Africa, but illness kind of forced him to return. And he's one of my only travelers who actually completely gives up his American identity and he becomes a British citizen over the issue of race. He sees an America of the 1880s that it's not going to change. He doesn't feel that America is capable of the kind of, I guess, opening up and not seeing his color and seeing him as a man instead.
Well, you know, when you deal with this, the issue of the separation of the races in America following the period, after the Reconstruction period, did you find any kind of identification that you, dealing with this, that you could bring into that period that would sort of justify Plessy versus Ferguson, the beginning of the separation of the races in this country?
Definitely. The white English travelers, they frequently referred to something as the Negro question, the Negro problem. What are we going to do with them? The English, coming over here felt that they could comment on the American problem better than Americans could. And yeah, definitely that's where that kind of racist kind of attitudes toward now African Americans really does kind of feed into definitely the separate but equal. There's only certain things that these people are capable of. And usually, going back to the issue of miscegenation, the argument that they frequently used, when thrown in the face with, here's a Frederick Douglass. He's an educated man. Obviously, he shouldn't be, spending his life digging ditches. The argument would come out that, well, it's because he has white blood in him. And that's when you start to really see this kind of focus on Anglo-Saxonism. And the Anglo-Saxon heritage. Ultimately leading to, I mean, if you really stretch this, arguments for separate but equal, and ultimately even social Darwinism and eugenics, when you take it to the extreme, obviously, with picking certain characteristics from one race as being superior to another. And I take it up to 1914, and it really, there's not much improvement during that time that you see really in kind of racial attitudes, because obviously segregation is so much a part of the American experience. And even in England, as they're expanding their empire, they're in Africa, they're in India, they're in Jamaica, and they're having problems. And they're coming to this very similar kind of conclusions that it seems that many Americans were as well.
Oftentimes we talk about, and especially since you mentioned the English, we talk about the white man's burden.
Yes.
How does that fit into this whole issue of, race and nationality at this particular point?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, it kind of comes back to Thomas L. Johnson, too, except it was, for him, it was a black man's burden. He wanted to go to Africa and convert the Africans. As a black former slave, he found the Word of God and wanted to bring it to others. And that definitely fits in, obviously, with the settlement of Africa, the exploration, etc., this burden to kind of convert and improve. How successful it was. You'd have to ask the colonized people. I don't think they probably agree that that white man's burden was, they didn't ask for it, they didn't want it, and now they have to kind of deal with it. So.
Well, the whole issue of race has been a very, very important issue in American history, and with the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, I think the whole thing has sort of changed in terms of integration and et cetera. But now, how do you see, I also know that while you're dealing with this particular period, that you also go further in terms of your own knowledge and information in reference to this. How do you see the period since 1954 and the whole issue of race over the last couple of minutes that we have here?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, there's even hints in the period I focus on when blacks and whites have contact with each other. And socialize together and get to know each other, that's really where you start to have breakthroughs. It's not too earth-shattering. But definitely with Brown versus Topeka, government needed to step in and do something to bring about a different kind of a way of looking at each other. And that's really, that's why I was kind of so excited about travel writing. Because when you're a traveler, you do mix with other people. And you start... Well, some of them, my travelers, are what we call racist. There are glimmers of what's coming in the future, in the 50s and the 60s, of a real effort on parts of people of all races, both races, at least for my sake here, trying to understand each other a little better. One
of the most important individuals, I think, dealing with this whole issue of race is Mr. Abraham Lincoln. In your study, could you give us some information in terms of what you know about him from your study? We've got about a minute to go here.
Yeah,
just sort of give us some statements.
Actually, you know what? Considering that the book actually covers right when Lincoln's in there, I do not touch on Lincoln. Other presidents were very accessible to these travelers. I assume if we hadn't been in the Civil War, I would have had some of my travelers visiting, but I think it was a little busy with other work at hand. Definitely, yeah, his role is kind of central. Oddly enough, the black Americans, they thought Queen Victoria was much better than Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln, very
because
good.
she freed the slaves.
Very good, and so that's some very, very good information to know that in terms of how black travelers regarded these national leaders, that Queen Victoria, and since England ended the institution of slavery earlier, that they would prefer Victoria over Abraham Lincoln, even though he is considered by many African Americans the great emancipator.
Sure.
And of course, Dr. Schmeller, let me thank you over the last couple of minutes, seconds that we have here for coming by and bringing us that very, very important issue dealing with race in America. And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.